The town of Millridge had always been peaceful, its tree-lined streets and quiet neighborhoods making it the kind of place where nothing ever seemed out of place. But behind closed doors, the Duncan family was hiding a secret that would shock everyone who thought they knew them. Margaret Duncan, the matriarch of the family, was a woman in her late 60s with a commanding presence. Despite her age, she was known for her vibrant energy and sharp wit. Her husband Samuel had passed away many years ago, and since then, Margaret had lived alone in the family's large home. But she was never truly alone. Her two grandsons, Tyler and Ben, both in their late 20s, lived with her. They had moved in after Samuel's death, offering their support as Margaret grew older. Tyler was the older of the two grandsons, tall and with dark curly hair. He had a quiet demeanor, keeping mostly to himself, but there was a coldness in his eyes that some people found unsettling. Ben, on the other hand, was more outgoing. He had a charming smile and always seemed to be the life of the party. Despite their differences, the two grandsons had always been close, even if their bond had started to feel peculiar to some. Margaret had never been the conventional grandmother. She was open-minded, liberal in her views, and she had always encouraged her grandsons to explore their own desires and passions. It wasn't uncommon for her to have frank discussions with them about relationships, intimacy, and the importance of living life to the fullest. But one day, this encouragement took a strange turn. It started with small comments, casual remarks about the importance of freedom in relationships, followed by long discussions at the dinner table about open marriages and non-traditional lifestyles. At first, Tyler and Ben had simply listened, intrigued by their grandmother's unconventional views. But then one night, during a late-night conversation after a few drinks, things took an unexpected and uncomfortable turn. Margaret suggested that the three of them explore the idea of a relationship where nothing was off limits, where all boundaries could be pushed. It wasn't clear whether she was serious, but her words hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Tyler and Ben were taken aback at first, unsure how to respond to their grandmother's suggestion. But as the days went by, they found themselves thinking about it more and more. What started as an outlandish idea began to take root in their minds, fueled by curiosity, alcohol, and the growing tension between the three of them. It was as if the lines between familial love and desire had started to blur, and none of them knew how to stop it. At first, it was just playful flirtation. Tyler would joke with Margaret, making her laugh, while Ben would subtly touch her arm or offer to help her with things around the house. But the jokes soon became more intimate, the touches more lingering. It was a dangerous game they were playing, and they all knew it, but none of them could turn away from it. As the weeks went on, the atmosphere in the Duncan household became increasingly tense. There were awkward silences at the dinner table, and the once warm and inviting home now felt like a prison. Margaret, Tyler, and Ben were trapped in a web of unspoken desires and mounting confusion. The idea that they were involved in something forbidden was both thrilling and terrifying. Then one fateful evening, it all came to a head. The tension that had been building for weeks finally exploded when a heated argument broke out between Tyler and Ben. The argument was about something trivial at first, but soon it spiraled into something much darker. Tyler accused Ben of crossing a line, of making things more than just a game. Ben, angry and defensive, accused Tyler of being too possessive, of trying to control everything. The words that were exchanged that night would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. The argument ended with Tyler storming out of the house, slamming the door behind him. But as he left, he didn't realize that the seeds of something far worse had been sown. The following morning, Margaret was found dead in her bed. The cause of death? A brutal, violent attack. The news of Margaret Duncan's death spread through the small town of Millridge like wildfire. The community, who had known Margaret as a strong-willed woman with an unshakable spirit, was in shock. The idea that someone could harm her, let alone take her life, was beyond comprehension. People gathered in hushed tones, exchanging worried glances, unsure of what could have happened behind the closed doors of the Duncan household. Detective Claire Thompson was called in to investigate. She had been with the Millridge Police Department for over 10 years and had seen her fair share of tragic cases, but this one felt different. The brutality of the crime was disturbing, and there was something about the way the house had been left that made her uneasy. It didn't seem like a simple robbery gone wrong or an act of random violence. It felt personal. Claire arrived at the Duncan home early that morning, the sun barely rising. The house was quiet, too quiet. Inside, everything appeared to be in its place, except for Margaret's body, found in her bedroom. The coroner had confirmed that Margaret had died from blunt force trauma to the head, but there were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry. It was as though the killer knew her intimately enough to get close without arousing suspicion. Tyler and Ben were the ones who found their grandmother's body. Ben had come downstairs first, looking for Margaret, as he always did, to check on her. When he saw her lying motionless in bed, he immediately ran to get Tyler. The two of them had called the police, their faces pale, their voices trembling with grief. Detective Thompson's first instinct was to speak with the grandsons. They were the closest to Margaret, and they were the ones who had discovered the body. As she sat down with them in the living room, she observed their reactions closely. Tyler's eyes were red from crying, but there was a coldness in his expression that didn't sit well with Claire. Ben, on the other hand, was visibly shaken, his hands fidgeting in his lap, his voice quivering. "I don't know how this happened," Ben said, his voice breaking. "I just came down this morning, and she was gone. I didn't even hear anything. I didn't hear anyone come in." Tyler sat silent beside him, his jaw clenched, his eyes staring at the floor. Claire could sense the tension between them, the unspoken distance. It was clear they were both devastated, but there was something else, something deeper, hidden beneath their grief. She decided to focus on their statements first before digging any deeper. "I need to ask a few questions," Claire said gently, though her voice had a firm edge. "What was your relationship like with your grandmother, Tyler?" "Ben?" Both grandsons seemed taken aback by the question, as if the answer was too obvious to be asked. She was everything to us," Ben replied, his voice steadying as he spoke about her. "She raised us after our parents, after they left us. We didn't have anyone else. She was always there." Tyler nodded, his expression hard to read. "She gave us everything. She loved us both. I can't believe she's gone." The detective could tell that there was more to their words than they were letting on, but she didn't push them just yet. Instead, she asked them about the night before, what they had been doing, if they'd had any disagreements with Margaret. "She was fine last night," Ben said quickly. "We were all just talking, eating dinner." "And did anything unusual happen last night?" Claire pressed, her eyes scanning both their faces. "No, nothing unusual," Tyler answered curtly, though his gaze avoided hers. Claire noticed the way he seemed to shut down when the conversation turned personal. As the interview continued, Claire felt something was off. The grandsons' reactions weren't matching the intensity of their grief. It wasn't normal for someone who had just lost a loved one to be so guarded, so controlled in their emotions. There was something they weren't saying. When Claire left the Duncan house that afternoon, she was no closer to answers, but she couldn't shake the feeling that both Tyler and Ben knew more than they were letting on. The investigation had just begun, and Claire knew she had to dig deeper into the family dynamics. The coroner's report came back the next day, confirming that Margaret's cause of death was blunt force trauma. There was no indication of a struggle, meaning Margaret had likely known her attacker. No signs of sexual assault, but the presence of defensive wounds indicated that Margaret had fought back in some way, though not enough to survive the attack. The lack of forced entry into the house confirmed that the killer had been someone she trusted. Claire started to dig into the history of the Duncan family, looking for any possible motives. She reached out to old neighbors, friends, and acquaintances of Margaret, piecing together fragments of her life. What she discovered was far more unsettling than she had expected. Margaret had been outspoken about her beliefs, often sharing unconventional ideas about relationships and freedom. Some of her close friends remembered her speaking of open relationships and how she encouraged her grandsons to explore their own desires. These conversations seemed harmless at first, but Claire now saw them in a different light. Could there have been more to Margaret's views than just philosophical musings? Did her openness invite something darker into the family? Then Claire uncovered something truly alarming, A report from a neighbor who had overheard a heated argument between Tyler and Ben only days before Margaret's death. The neighbor couldn't make out the words, but they had heard shouting, followed by a loud bang, like a door being slammed in anger. The timing was too close to be ignored. Was there a conflict between the two grandsons that went deeper than just petty arguments? With this new information, Claire was now sure that the grandsons were hiding something. It was time to take a closer look at their relationship with each other and with their grandmother. Detective Claire Thompson wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but with each new piece of evidence, the suspicion that Tyler and Ben Duncan were hiding something grew stronger. The overheard argument between the two grandsons was a critical breakthrough. It hinted at deeper tensions beneath the surface, but it didn't provide enough to connect them directly to Margaret's death. Claire knew she needed to gather more evidence, something concrete that could explain the motive behind the murder. Claire started by re-interviewing both Tyler and Ben separately. She wasn't about to let them feed her rehearsed responses again. This time, she was going to focus on the details that didn't add up. She began with Tyler. The interview took place in a small, dimly lit room at the police station, and Claire observed his body language carefully. Tyler had been quiet and distant in the previous interviews, but now there was something more in his eyes. Nervousness, perhaps, or guilt. Claire knew how to read people, and Tyler was clearly uncomfortable under her questioning. "Tyler, I know this is difficult, but I need you to walk me through your evening last night," Claire said, her tone calm but firm. "Where were you before you found your grandmother this morning?" Tyler shifted in his seat, avoiding her gaze. He ran a hand through his hair, visibly agitated. I was in my room," he said, his voice low. "I went to bed early, just like I always do. And Ben? Was he with you? Did you two talk before you went to bed?" "No," Tyler answered quickly, his eyes darting around the room. "He was doing his own thing, I guess. I didn't see him after dinner." Claire noted his hesitation. It wasn't normal for someone who had lived with a family member for so long to be so vague about the details. She pushed further. "And you didn't hear anything unusual that night? Any noise or commotion?" Tyler hesitated, then shook his head. "Number I was just sleeping." Claire wasn't convinced. Something about his response felt rehearsed. She pressed on. "Tyler, are you sure there's nothing you want to tell me? We know you and Ben had a fight the other day. What was that about?" Tyler's face turned pale, and for the first time during the interview, he locked eyes with Claire. The defensiveness in his posture became apparent as his body stiffened. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice rising slightly. "We fight sometimes. It's normal. But we didn't kill Grandma. We loved her. We would never hurt her." Claire studied his face carefully. It was a mask of feigned innocence, but beneath it, Claire could sense the tension, the flicker of something dark that he was trying to suppress. She wasn't about to let up now. After a tense silence, Claire stood up, her chair scraping the floor. "Okay, Tyler, we'll be back to speak with you again. But know this, if you're hiding something, we'll find out, and the truth always comes out." Tyler didn't respond as she left the room, his eyes following her every step. Claire was certain that he knew more than he was letting on, but she couldn't be sure just yet. It was time to speak with Ben. Ben's interview was just as revealing in its own way. Unlike Tyler, Ben didn't put on a tough facade. He seemed genuinely distraught, his face pale, his hands trembling as he recounted the events of the morning. But Claire noticed something else. He was nervous. There was an edge to his words that betrayed his unease. "Ben, I need to ask you about the fight between you and Tyler," Claire began. "What happened that day? Was it something serious?" Ben flinched slightly at the mention of the argument, his eyes widening as if the memories were painful. It wasn't anything," he stammered. "We were just arguing about stupid things. Nothing big. Tyler can be hard to talk to sometimes, but we were fine." "Really?" Claire pressed. "Because we've spoken to your neighbor, and they overheard shouting between you and Tyler. It didn't sound like a trivial disagreement. What was it really about?" Ben's face went blank for a moment before he spoke, his voice quiet. "We were arguing about Grandma, about how she treated us, how she treated us both differently." Claire raised an eyebrow. This was the first time either grandson had mentioned anything that might indicate deeper friction within the family. What do you mean by treated differently, Ben? Ben hesitated, looking down at his hands. It's nothing, just stupid stuff. She loved us both, but sometimes I felt like she was closer to Tyler, like she wanted him more. He never noticed, but I did. And I hated it. I hated how he always got her attention. But it wasn't a big deal. We fought about that, but it wasn't about killing her. Claire watched his eyes, reading his discomfort. She could tell that the fight was more significant than Ben was letting on. The tension between him and Tyler was clearly a lot deeper than simple sibling rivalry. But there was still no clear motive for murder. Ben's statements didn't match the severity of the crime. His guilt, however, was becoming more apparent. Ben, tell me again about the night of your grandmother's death. What happened after you had dinner? I told you, Ben replied quickly. I went to my room. I didn't see Tyler, and I didn't hear anything. Claire nodded. And nothing at all seemed out of the ordinary? Ben's eyes flickered, but he quickly shook his head. Everything was fine. I swear. As Claire wrapped up her interviews with both grandsons, the sense of unease in her gut grew. Both of them were hiding something, but she couldn't yet pinpoint what it was. There were pieces missing, and the more she dug, the more those pieces seemed to slip through her fingers. However, one thing was becoming clearer. There was something deeply wrong in the Duncan family. The relationship between Tyler, Ben, and their grandmother was more complicated than they were letting on. Later that evening, Claire sat at her desk, reviewing the case file. Her phone rang, breaking the silence. It was a call from the coroner's office. The forensic analysis on Margaret Duncan's body has come back, the voice on the other end said. We found traces of something unusual under her fingernails. We think she fought with her attacker, but there's more. We also found traces of a drug in her system, something that could have knocked her out before the attack. That was the breakthrough Claire needed. It wasn't just a brutal attack, it was a premeditated murder, and someone had drugged Margaret before killing her. Detective Claire Thompson sat back in her chair, her mind racing. The revelation that Margaret Duncan had been drugged before her murder was a game changer. It confirmed her suspicions that the crime had been premeditated, but it also deepened the mystery. If Margaret had been incapacitated before the attack, it meant that her killer had planned everything carefully, ensuring that she wouldn't be able to defend herself. But who would do such a thing? The traces of the drug found in Margaret's system were identified as a sedative, one that was commonly used for medical purposes, but could also be obtained illegally. It wasn't a substance that would be easy to get by someone without some knowledge of pharmaceuticals. Claire's first thought was to take another look at the family's dynamics, specifically the grandsons. She had already suspected that Tyler and Ben were hiding something, but now she needed to find out how deep the secrets ran. The drug found in Margaret's system suggested that whoever had killed her had access to it, or at the very least, knew where to obtain it. Could one of them have drugged her, or had someone else been involved? Claire decided to revisit the scene of the crime, hoping that something new might surface. The Duncan home was eerily quiet, the place where so many memories had been made now overshadowed by tragedy. She walked through the rooms, retracing her steps from the day of the murder. When she entered Margaret's bedroom, Claire noticed something she hadn't before: an open bottle of sleeping pills on the nightstand. The label had been partially torn off, but the bottle was still mostly full. It seemed out of place. Had Margaret been taking these pills for sleep issues, or had someone planted the bottle there to throw off the investigation? Claire made a mental note to investigate the sleeping pills further, but her immediate focus was still on the grandsons. She had to find out where they had been the night of the murder, and if either of them had the means to obtain the sedative. The next day, Claire brought both Tyler and Ben in for further questioning. This time she was more direct. She wasn't interested in hearing vague statements or half-truths. It was time to get to the bottom of things. She started with Tyler. Tyler, she began, her voice steady but firm, we found traces of a sedative in your grandmother's system. It's not something that can be easily obtained. Do you know anything about this drug? Tyler's expression hardened, and for a moment, Claire saw the anger flicker in his eyes. He quickly masked it with a calm demeanor, but she could sense the tension in the air. No, he replied, his voice tight. I don't know anything about it. Claire didn't believe him. She leaned forward, her gaze intense. Tyler, we also found some sleeping pills in your grandmother's bedroom. Do you know where they came from? He shook his head. Number, I don't know anything about that either. Claire was beginning to lose patience. Tyler, if you're hiding something, it's only going to make things worse for you. Did you have access to any drugs or sedatives? Did you give them to your grandmother? Tyler looked down at the table, his fingers tapping nervously. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't drug her, he said quickly. But Ben, he had access to those kinds of things. Claire's heart skipped a beat. This was the breakthrough she needed. What do you mean? How do you know this? Tyler's eyes flickered toward the door, as if making sure no one else was listening. Ben has always been into alternative medicine. He's been looking into herbal remedies, treatments, stuff like that. He's got connections. He's always been interested in things like sedatives and sleeping pills. He's been obsessed with it for months. Claire's mind raced. Ben had connections to drugs and sedatives? This was the kind of information she had been searching for. She pressed on. Why would Ben want to hurt your grandmother? Tyler looked conflicted, as if the answer was too painful to say. I don't know, but he was always jealous of her, always jealous of how close she was to me. I think he resented her. He was always trying to get her attention, to make her see him as something more than just a grandson. But she never did. She always preferred me. Claire's eyes narrowed as she processed the information. Tyler's statement confirmed what she had already suspected. There was deep tension between the two grandsons, and it had been building for some time. But could it have escalated to the point of murder? And why was Tyler protecting Ben now? Before she could ask more questions, she was interrupted by a call from her team. The results of the drug analysis on the sleeping pills had come in. It wasn't just any over-the-counter medication. The pills had been laced with the same sedative found in Margaret's system. Claire's suspicion was confirmed. Whoever had drugged Margaret had also been the one to leave the pills behind in her room, perhaps to make it look like a natural overdose. Claire's next step was to confront Ben. She had heard Tyler's accusations, but now she needed to hear Ben's side of the story. She brought him in for questioning that afternoon. Ben was visibly nervous, his eyes darting around the room as Claire asked him about the sedative. Ben, Claire started, her tone calm but insistent. Tyler told me that you've been looking into sedatives and sleeping pills. Is that true? Ben's face went pale. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. I don't know what he's talking about. I never gave her anything. Claire studied him closely. Ben, we found the sedative in your grandmother's system. We also found the sleeping pills in her room, and we know they were laced with the same sedative. Can you explain that? Ben's eyes flickered for a moment before he looked away, staring at his hands. I didn't kill her, he said, his voice trembling. I didn't hurt her. I just wanted her to love me more. I wanted her to see me, to notice me. Tyler always had her attention. I hated it. Claire's mind was racing as she pieced the puzzle together. Ben's jealousy, his fixation on his grandmother's affection, was the motive. But it still didn't explain the murder. Could he have drugged her out of anger? Or had someone else been involved in the crime? I didn't mean to hurt her, Ben continued, his voice barely a whisper. But I wanted her to see me differently. I thought if I made her sleep, just for a little while, maybe we could talk. Maybe she'd finally see me. Claire took a deep breath. It was clear now that Ben's obsession with his grandmother had gone too far. But had it been him who killed her? Or had someone else taken advantage of his fragile state to carry out the murder? Ben, Claire said, her voice firm, I think you know more than you're letting on. We'll get to the truth. And when we do, you'll have to face it. As Claire left the interrogation room, she knew she was getting closer to the truth, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Was Ben acting alone, or was there another player in this twisted family drama? The investigation was far from over, but Claire had one thing on her side. The truth was starting to unravel. The tension in the Duncan case was palpable. Detective Claire Thompson had spent days interrogating Tyler and Ben, gathering evidence, and piecing together their stories. Both grandsons were clearly hiding something, but Claire was still struggling to understand the full extent of their involvement in Margaret Duncan's death. The most disturbing part was Ben's confession, his jealousy, his need for attention, and the implication that he might have used drugs on his grandmother to manipulate her into giving him the affection he felt he deserved. But was that enough to push him to murder her, or was there someone else involved? After her conversation with Ben, Claire was left with a nagging feeling that there was more to the story. Ben's words didn't fully add up. While his jealousy was evident, his explanation for drugging Margaret didn't ring true as the ultimate motive for murder. She needed a breakthrough, something that would tie everything together, and it came from an unexpected source. Tyler. Tyler had always seemed like the more composed of the two grandsons. He had been calm during their initial interviews, but now something about his demeanor had changed. There was a visible crack in his armor, a flicker of guilt, a hint of fear he hadn't shown before. Claire had to trust her instincts. She revisited his earlier statements, replaying every word, every pause. It was then that she realized something crucial he had said. The comment about Ben having connections, about Ben being obsessed with sedatives. At first, Claire had assumed Tyler was trying to deflect suspicion onto his brother. But what if he wasn't entirely lying? What if Tyler was protecting someone? What if he had played a part in this and was too afraid to admit it? It was late in the afternoon when Claire received a call that would change everything. The forensic team had managed to recover something from the scene that had been overlooked initially, a discarded piece of fabric caught in the bedroom window. At first glance, it looked insignificant, but when the lab results came back, it was a match for a shirt belonging to Tyler Duncan. The revelation hit Claire like a punch to the stomach. Tyler had been in his grandmother's bedroom the night of her death. He hadn't just been an innocent bystander, as he had claimed. He had been there, and now there was physical evidence to prove it. Claire knew this was the key to unlocking the entire case. She immediately called for another round of questioning with Tyler, this time bringing in a forensic expert to confirm the match. When Tyler entered the interrogation room, he looked even more nervous than before. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands trembled as he sat down. He must have known the game was up. Claire didn't waste any time. Tyler, we found a piece of your shirt in your grandmother's bedroom. It matches what you were wearing the night she died. How do you explain that? Tyler's face went pale and his mouth went dry. He swallowed hard, but his words faltered as they left his lips. I don't know. I didn't kill her, detective. I swear. I went in there to check on her, that's all. Claire leaned in, her voice steady but intense. You've been lying to me, Tyler. First you said you didn't know anything about the drugs, and now we have proof you were in the room that night. What happened in that room? Tyler's hands clenched into fists, and for a brief moment, Claire thought he might lash out. But then he slumped, defeated, his eyes brimming with tears. Okay, I'll tell you, Tyler said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was there, but I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear. Claire's heart raced as she sat forward. What do you mean? What happened? Tyler took a shaky breath and began his story. The night before Grandma died, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about everything, about how things had been with Ben, about how I always had to be the one to keep everything together. It felt like I was carrying the weight of the world. Grandma and I used to be close, but lately, it was like she'd pulled away from me, like she didn't need me anymore. She started paying more attention to Ben, and it made me feel abandoned. I hated that feeling. Tyler paused, his eyes distant. Claire could see the internal struggle he was facing, torn between guilt and justification. I went to her room that night to talk to her. I was hoping we could reconnect, that maybe she'd see how much I cared. But when I got in there, I heard her talking to Ben. She was comforting him, telling him he was going to be just fine. It was like she didn't even notice me. She was all about him. And I couldn't take it anymore. I thought, maybe if I just made her sleep for a while, we could have that talk. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than that. Claire's stomach churned as she processed his words. This was a new side of the story, one she hadn't anticipated. Tyler's obsession with his grandmother's affection had driven him to act impulsively, but he wasn't acting alone. "So, what did you do?" Claire pressed. I I gave her the sedative, Tyler said, his voice breaking. Ben had been talking about it for weeks. He told me how it could help people relax, how it could put them to sleep. I didn't know much about it, but I trusted him. I thought it would work. Claire's blood ran cold. "You drugged her?" Tyler nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "Yes, but it wasn't supposed to kill her. I just wanted her to sleep, to finally notice me. I thought it would work, that we could talk. But she didn't wake up." "She didn't wake up, Detective." Claire's mind was spinning. Tyler's confession confirmed everything she had suspected. The drugging of Margaret was a key part of the crime. But it wasn't the entire story. The deeper question was still hanging over the case. Was Tyler alone in this, or had Ben played a more active role than he was letting on? At that moment, a key piece of evidence came through from the lab, a fingerprint match from the sedative vial found in Margaret's room. The fingerprint wasn't Tyler's, it was Ben's. The shock of this new discovery hit Claire hard. Ben had not just been a passive participant. He had been involved in the planning of his grandmother's drugging, and now it seemed he had helped Tyler carry out the crime. But why? Tyler's confession had unraveled much of the mystery, but it had also raised new questions. The investigation wasn't over yet. Now Claire needed to figure out how deep Ben's involvement went and whether he had been the one who finally pushed Tyler to go through with it. Detective Claire Thompson felt the weight of the case pressing down on her. The shocking discovery of Ben's fingerprint on the sedative vial had changed everything. Up until this point, the investigation had been a labyrinth of lies and half-truths, but now the pieces were starting to fit together in a way that was both disturbing and illuminating. Tyler had confessed to drugging his grandmother, but Ben's involvement suggested that the tragedy had been more calculated than either grandson had admitted. As Claire prepared for another round of questioning, she knew she had to approach Ben carefully. The truth was within reach, but there was still something about his behavior that didn't sit right with her. He had been evasive, but perhaps now that the evidence was clear, he would finally crack and reveal his role in his grandmother's death. She had already questioned Tyler, and his confession had implicated Ben as the mastermind. But would Ben admit to what he had done? It was late in the evening when Ben was brought into the interrogation room once again. He looked worse than the last time Claire had seen him, his eyes red and swollen, his clothes wrinkled. There was a palpable sense of defeat in the air, as though he knew the jig was up. He sat down heavily in the chair, his shoulders slumped. Claire wasted no time. "Ben," she said, her voice firm yet calm, "we found your fingerprints on the sedative vial. You know what this means, don't you?" Ben stared at the table, avoiding her gaze. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was his shallow breathing. Claire could see him processing the information, weighing his options. Then finally he looked up, his eyes hollow. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he whispered. "I never meant for her to die." Claire leaned forward. "Tell me what happened, Ben. Tell me everything." Ben closed his eyes, and for the first time, Claire saw genuine remorse in his expression. His voice cracked as he began to speak. I never really had a chance, did I?" Ben started, his words soft, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "Tyler always got Grandma's attention. He was her favorite, always. I did everything I could to get her to notice me, but it was never enough. She never saw me the way I wanted her to. She was always so focused on him." Claire felt a pang of empathy for Ben. She could see how much he had craved his grandmother's approval, how deeply he had been hurt by the perceived rejection. But that didn't excuse what had happened. "I started talking to Tyler about it," Ben continued, his voice shaking. "I told him how I felt, about how Grandma never really paid attention to me. I told him that I needed something to help me, something that would make her see me, maybe even make her like me more." That's when Tyler mentioned the sedative. Claire's heart sank. She had known that Tyler had brought up the idea of using the sedative, but she hadn't realized how deeply Ben had been involved in suggesting it. Tyler's confession had made it clear that he had followed Ben's lead, but hearing it from Ben's mouth was a stark revelation. Ben wiped his face with his sleeve, a tear escaping from his eye. At first, I didn't think Tyler would go through with it. I didn't think he'd actually do it. But then, he came to me the night before Grandma died, and he said he'd gotten the sedative. He said it would put her to sleep, just for a little while. That way, we could talk to her. That way, she'd finally notice me too. Claire listened carefully, piecing together the narrative in her mind. Ben's jealousy of his brother, combined with his desperation for his grandmother's approval, had driven him to manipulate Tyler into helping him drug her. But why didn't they stop at just putting her to sleep? Why had it escalated into murder? I thought, if we could just make her sleep, we could talk, and she would finally see that I mattered. Ben confessed, his voice filled with regret. But Tyler didn't stop there. When he gave her the sedative, he said it didn't seem like enough. He wanted her to be completely out of it so we could have all the time we needed with her. And when we did that, we thought she'd wake up. Claire's stomach twisted in response to Ben's words. You thought she'd wake up? Ben nodded. We thought it was just a sleeping pill, just a little something to make her relax. But she didn't wake up. She didn't wake up, and I didn't know what to do. I panicked. Claire's mind raced as she processed the revelation. This wasn't just a crime of passion, it was a crime of manipulation and desperation, fueled by insecurities and a twisted need for affection. Ben's confession confirmed Tyler's role in the crime, but it painted a clearer picture of how the two brothers had become complicit in their grandmother's death. Ben, Claire asked, her voice steady but with a note of disbelief, did you know the sedative could kill her? Ben's eyes widened and he shook his head rapidly. Number, I didn't know. I thought it would just make her sleep. I thought we could fix everything, that we could finally get the attention we both wanted. Claire felt a mix of anger and sympathy toward Ben. He had been consumed by his need for validation, for something as simple as his grandmother's love, and it had clouded his judgment. But ultimately, he had played a major role in the death of the woman who had raised him. There was a long silence as Ben wiped his face and tried to compose himself. He had admitted to his involvement in the crime, but there was still something unsettling about his attitude. Was he genuinely remorseful, or was he just trying to cover up the fact that he had been complicit in murder? Ben, Claire said, breaking the silence, this isn't just about you and Tyler anymore. This is about a life lost, a family torn apart, and the truth. You need to face the consequences of what you've done. Your grandmother deserves justice. Ben nodded slowly, his eyes hollow. I understand. I'll take responsibility for everything. I just didn't know it would go this far. I didn't think it would end like this. Claire stood up, signaling the end of the interview. She had heard enough. The pieces were finally coming together. The drugging of Margaret Duncan had started out as a desperate attempt for attention from her grandsons, but it had escalated into something far darker. The sedative, which had been intended to make her sleep, had ultimately caused her death, and both grandsons had been complicit in her demise. As Claire walked out of the room, she felt a sense of closure, but also an overwhelming sadness. The tragedy had torn apart a family, and no amount of justice would ever truly bring back the matriarch they had lost. But at least the truth had come to light. The investigation wasn't over yet. There were still legal processes to follow, but Claire knew that this case had been solved. It had been a twisted, heartbreaking tale of jealousy, manipulation, and family dysfunction. And now the two grandsons would have to face the consequences of their actions. Detective Claire Thompson stood at the edge of the police station parking lot, the cold evening air brushing against her skin. The investigation into Margaret Duncan's death had been long and grueling, and though the truth had come to light, the reality of it all weighed heavily on her. The case wasn't just another unsolved crime or another notch on her belt as a seasoned investigator. It had been a tragedy, a painful reminder of the darker aspects of human nature. But now, with the confessions from both grandsons, justice would be served. The legal process would take over from here, but the emotional toll of the case would linger for Claire for a long time. The Duncans, once a seemingly happy family, had been torn apart by their own secrets and jealousies. Tyler and Ben's twisted affection for their grandmother had driven them to extremes, culminating in a tragedy that could have been avoided. Claire had worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, but she knew that in the end, it wouldn't change the fact that Margaret Duncan was dead. The court hearings began weeks later. The news of Margaret's death had shocked the community, and the revelation of the involvement of her grandsons stirred a mixture of disbelief and outrage. The story made headlines across the country. But as the trial proceeded, it was clear that the family, once tight-knit, was now fractured beyond repair. Tyler and Ben, who had grown up under the same roof, sat on opposite sides of the courtroom, their faces lined with guilt and fear. Tyler's defense lawyer tried to argue that he had acted out of a sense of desperation and that he had never intended for his grandmother to die. His confession, however, worked against him, and the jury found it hard to believe that he hadn't known the potential consequences of administering the sedative. The fact that he had participated in drugging Margaret with the clear intent to put her to sleep for hours painted a picture of premeditation, even if the murder itself had been unintentional. Ben's case was more complicated. While he had also confessed to his role in the crime, his defense lawyer painted him as a vulnerable young man who had been manipulated by Tyler. They argued that Ben had been desperate for his grandmother's love and had followed his brother's lead. But the fingerprint evidence, his prints on the sedative vial, was damning. It was clear that Ben hadn't just been a passive participant, he had been an active agent in the crime. His role in procuring the sedative and encouraging Tyler to go through with the plan couldn't be ignored. As the trial continued, the brothers' contrasting personalities became more evident. Tyler, though remorseful, was more calculating. He had been the one to suggest using the sedative, and his confession showed that he had known more about what they were doing than he had initially let on. Ben, on the other hand, was more emotional. His guilt seemed more genuine, but it didn't change the fact that he had been complicit in his grandmother's death. After weeks of deliberation, the verdicts were finally read. Tyler was sentenced to 20 years in prison for manslaughter, his charges reduced due to his confession and the fact that the murder had not been premeditated. Ben, on the other hand, was sentenced to 15 years, with the possibility of parole after 10. The court acknowledged his emotional state and the manipulation by his brother, but ultimately it held him accountable for his actions. The brothers' fates were sealed, but the damage they had caused to their family could never be undone. Margaret Duncan's funeral had been a somber affair, with no family members present except for Tyler and Ben. The two young men had not only lost their grandmother, but had also lost each other, their relationship irrevocably shattered by their crime. Detective Claire Thompson was present at the sentencing, watching from the back of the courtroom as the brothers were led away in handcuffs. She had seen many criminals over the years, but the guilt and grief on Tyler and Ben's faces haunted her. There was no satisfaction in seeing justice served, no sense of victory in this case. The loss of Margaret Duncan was something that couldn't be undone, and her family would never be the same. After the trial, Claire went to the cemetery where Margaret Duncan had been laid to rest. It was a quiet spot nestled in the countryside, with trees lining the edges of the property. Claire stood by the grave for a long time, reflecting on the case. She thought about how easily things could have gone differently, how simple feelings of neglect and jealousy had led to the death of a woman who had once been a loving grandmother. The media frenzy surrounding the case had long since died down, and life for the Duncans' neighbors returned to normal. But for Claire, it was a case that would stay with her forever. The darkness within the family, the twisted emotions, and the manipulation were difficult to forget. In her line of work, Claire had seen many tragic cases, but this one had been personal in a way that none of the others had been. It was a case about family, about love, and about how easily it could be destroyed by selfishness. As she walked away from the cemetery, Claire couldn't help but think about the lessons the case had taught her. The desire for love and attention could make people do unspeakable things, but in the end, it was the people left behind who had to bear the consequences. Tyler and Ben might have been the ones to physically commit the crime, but the real tragedy was the way they had torn apart a family that had once been whole. They had destroyed not just a life, but the fabric of a family's bond, a bond that could never be repaired. Detective Claire Thompson's job was far from over. The cases would keep coming, the crimes would keep piling up, and she would keep doing her best to bring justice to those who had been wronged. But for this case, for the Duncan family, there would never be a happy ending. The only thing Claire could do was ensure that the truth had been revealed, that the ones responsible had been held accountable, and that justice, in whatever form it could take, had been served. The final chapter of the Duncan case had been written, and though it was tragic, Claire knew that the truth had been uncovered. The Duncans, like many families, had been broken by their own inner turmoil, but now at least they could rest knowing the truth was out. And with that, Claire moved on to her next case. The world would keep turning, but the ghosts of the Duncan family would stay with her for a long time to come.